This coming Wednesday, May 20th, marks 7 years since Volodymyr Zelensky took office as president of Ukraine. Elected as a political outsider who vowed to curb corruption and bring Ukraine closer to a democratic European future, Zelensky could never have imagined that full-scale war would extend his tenure this far beyond its 5-year term. And as we close in on year 7, there's still no clear end date. Zelensky will remain president until elections can be safely held, even as evidence mounts of members of his own circle engaging in the same kind of corruption and cronyism that he swore to eradicate back in 2019. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv. This week, we're going to unpack how Zelensky went from being an anti-establishment newcomer to being entrenched in the establishment, to the point of all but contradicting his campaign promises. With such a transformation, can he still be said to represent the people who elected him back in 2019? Now you might ask, why are we talking about domestic scandals now, when Ukraine's primary objective is defending itself from an invader? And our answer remains that when people are fighting every day for Ukraine's freedom, it's our job to shine light on threats to it, no matter where they come from. Very briefly, because this part's been documented a lot already. Volodymyr Zelensky was born in Kryvyi Rih in 1978, making him 48 years old today. Kryvyi Rih is the 8th biggest city in Ukraine, and its reputation isn't especially glamorous. It's a very long, narrow city filled with mines, refineries, and factories, and it's located pretty remotely in an industrial belt stretching across south-central Ukraine. Zelensky, who was raised in a Russian-speaking Jewish family, studied law at university but never worked in the legal field, instead entering the world of comedy and entertainment. In 2003, he co-founded the performing group and production company Kvartal 95, which produced a lot of satirical comedy with a broad populist appeal. Think along the lines of Saturday Night Live or Mock the Week. And one of the series created by the company was Servant of the People, which came out in 2015 and starred Zelensky as an ordinary guy who becomes president of Ukraine by chance. Now, whether Zelensky conceived of the show as a political campaign from the start is up for debate, but after 3 seasons he announced that he was running for the actual office, which he won in a 73% landslide against billionaire Petro Poroshenko, who was running for re-election after serving as president from 2014 to 2019. Zelensky's party name? Servant of the People. His campaign promises to rid Ukraine's government of corruption and other institutional rot, to reform the judicial system, and to end Russia's war in eastern Ukraine, which was now in the 5th year of what we now think of as the first stage before the full-scale invasion. Remember, this was 2019. Most people hadn't heard of a coronavirus, and most people couldn't imagine Russian tanks on the highways around Kyiv under any circumstances. When he entered office, many wrote Zelensky off as inexperienced and rogue, but others saw him as a breath of fresh air in a system that had too long been plagued by corruption and insider politics, not by populism. Early descriptions of him aren't dissimilar from those attributed to US President Donald Trump, with whom many comparisons have been made, given that they both went from television personalities to presidents within the span of just a few years, both running on a platform of anti-establishment, new blood disruption. However, Trump and Zelensky are more than just foils to one another. Just after Zelensky took office in 2019, Trump pressured him over the phone to investigate the Ukraine-related dealings of Hunter Biden, son of rival US politician and still not yet President Joe Biden. Now, Trump's goal in pressuring Zelensky to start an investigation was to make Biden look bad ahead of the 2020 US presidential election. But instead, the move formed the basis of Trump's first impeachment, because it's obviously illegal for a sitting US president to try to enlist a foreign leader to dig up dirt on an election competitor. And Trump did more than just try to entice Zelensky into helping him. The inquiry into the phone call found that Trump used military aid for Ukraine as a bargaining chip and threatened to withhold it if Zelensky didn't comply. And I'm mentioning this particular early chapter in Zelensky's presidency because it's an important part of the complicated ongoing relationship between the Ukrainian and American administrations, where Trump still stands at the helm 7 years later. But it was also a signal that though a political newcomer he might be, Zelensky wouldn't be easily fazed by the trickier aspects of the job. And like I alluded to, things only became more complicated from there. First, there was COVID. We can't talk about the last half-decade without mentioning it, and it was as much a nightmare for Ukraine as anywhere, particularly given that there'd already been 6 years of war in the east when everything shut down. That crisis took up Zelensky's first couple of years in office, and then in his third year, Russia fully invaded. Zelensky famously declined to leave the country even as allies offered to evacuate him, with the now iconic quote, "I need ammunition, not a ride." I can't overstate how much it meant here and abroad that Zelensky was the president who stayed and stood his ground. He was a leader that people could rally behind at the worst moment, and he showed that Ukraine wouldn't surrender without a fight. And since February 24th, 2022, he's acted as Ukraine's primary representative on the world stage, which is something of a cursed role that he's done as well as anyone could ask of him. He's engaged in successful diplomacy on many fronts, while refusing to sell out his country for a bad peace deal. Like I said in the introduction, Zelensky's presidency was set to expire 2 years ago, but it's been extended under martial law because it's nearly impossible to hold free and fair elections in a country that's putting all of its resources into defending itself. We're now in another zone of undetermined time that Zelensky will remain in office until elections can be held, which isn't entirely unprecedented in times of crisis. Between the Great Depression and World War II, Franklin Roosevelt was president of the US for 12 consecutive years. But this video isn't a puff piece on how Zelensky is handling the pressures of extended leadership. With his tenure stretching on indefinitely, inconsistencies are increasingly showing between the platform Zelensky ran on versus the government that he's helming 7 years later. And that's what we're really going to get into today. In writing this episode, I kept thinking that the last 7 years in Ukraine has felt like 7 centuries worth of events to handle, not least for the news outlets covering it all. The Kyiv Independent was born out of the desire to see a robust free press in an independent Ukraine, and our objective hasn't changed even with the outbreak of war. In fact, it's become more critical than ever. And behind our frontline reporting, newsletters, war crimes investigations, and shows just like this is a group of more than 29,000 people around the world who donate a small amount each month to keep us going. And when you join, you get some cool perks, including the ability to ask questions to be answered on this show. If you'd like to find out more, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. And I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is so appreciated. As I mentioned, Zelensky's main campaign promise was that he was an outsider, a young person, a representative of modern Ukraine that wanted to move away from a history of corruption and oligarch control. His party called for reform of economic and judicial institutions, with the goal of restoring public trust in various civil processes long considered corrupt or obsolete. When he took office in 2019, many Ukrainians were hopeful that these promised reforms would bring the country closer to European integration, and that hope has become much more pointed in the years since. During Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine's bid to join the European Union has been expedited, but it still hinges on Ukraine demonstrating sufficient reform of its institutions in line with EU standards. And while Ukraine has proved beyond a doubt that it's capable of governing itself under extreme pressure, as well as any EU country would, it still consistently fails to hit the benchmarks for reform set by the alliance as conditions for membership. The fact that Zelensky tried to effectively undermine the independence of the anti-corruption agencies that would demonstrate clear evidence of Ukraine's reform shows just how far he's diverted from his original course, at a time when the stakes couldn't be higher. And nothing has drawn this all into focus like the ongoing corruption scandal involving multiple investigations that implicate people at the highest echelons of Zelensky's administration and inner circle. According to the investigation, a group of officials and other people associated with Zelensky are suspected of laundering 460 million hryvnia, or 8.9 million USD, between 2021 and 2025 through the construction of a luxury housing complex outside of Kyiv. At least part of those funds are suspected to have been illegally obtained through a kickback scheme at Energoatom, the nuclear state agency. According to prosecutors, the 4 houses that were built in the cottage complex may belong to Timur Mindich, a businessman and longtime associate of Zelensky from his entertainment days, Alexei Chernyshov, former deputy prime minister and a friend of Zelensky's family, Andriy Yermak, former head of the presidential office, and a certain individual identified as Vova, a diminutive form of Volodymyr. Mindich and Chernyshov have been under investigation as suspects since last year, and Yermak was just charged this week. Now, to learn more about that scandal, I recommend you check out the interview we recently did with one of the leading Ukrainian journalists covering the case, who illustrates just how close this cuts to Zelensky. There'll be a link to that video in the description below. I'm now joined in conversation by my colleague Danylo Mokryk, who covered Ukraine's domestic politics for many years before joining the Kyiv Independent's War Crimes Investigations Unit. He still follows domestic issues closely for his own project. So, just to start with, what was your introduction to Zelensky? How surprising was it when he became a politician?
Well, it was a surprise. I mean, I first heard about him as a potential presidential candidate somewhere in 2018, and I saw the high ratings that he had. But I never thought that those ratings would transform into an actual result in an election, because there is a difference in my mind between saying that I would vote for someone in a poll and actually voting at the presidential election. But in 2019, well, it became apparent that, well, this is serious, and he could actually become president. And, well, he did.
Can you maybe describe the system that he was positioning himself in opposition to? Like, if he was a newcomer, what was differentiating him?
To me, it's the same political logic as, for example, Donald Trump was following in 2016. Like a populist, certainly, declaring to be different from the whole political class, promising like easy, swift changes in government, etc. He did not really promise serious institutional reforms. He did not really present a strategic vision. The only thing that he promised was to get rid of people that were corrupt, get rid of politicians that were corrupt. He tried to position himself as a completely different person from President Poroshenko. And a bit later, at the parliamentary election, he actually decided not to take any of the former politicians or former members of parliament into his party, so promising, a clean slate. So the logic was not institutional, but rather shallow. Like we would just change all the people.
Would you say that the system changed under Zelensky?
I would not say that the system changed. And a great example of that is his presidential office. Okay, so traditionally in Ukrainian politics, the president's administration, which is now called the presidential office, is invested by political power that is not in the constitution, that is not in law. So it is a center of decision-making, of influence, political, but also judicial, for example, influence over law enforcement that is just there. And he copied that from all the previous presidents. So he changed the name of the institution, but he did not change the functioning of the institution. And that is, I think, one of the great examples of how his promise of change was very shallow and very superficial. He changed the names, but he did not change the system.
But in the last year, he's seen widespread protests, these scandals, these kind of blows to his public image. What are the mistakes that he's made? How has this backfired on him?
Well, it's still the same. It's trying to grab more power that Constitution gives him. It's trying to protect his own against criminal proceedings and criminal charges. And that was the reason, for example, for his attempt to weaken the anti-corruption institutions in Ukraine by a swift law change, and people of Ukraine actually slapping him on the wrist by mass protests, telling him, no, you cannot do that. The good thing is that he reacted to that. Volodymyr Zelensky was never part of those popular uprisings in Ukraine, like the Orange Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity, also called Euromaidan. He was never one of the faces of that. So he does not have, this genetic political memory of that. But he still seems to remember the story and to be, in a way, fearful of the street. I also have to say that what is happening right now, all of his closest political allies and all of his closest friends, like Timur Mindich, Alexei Chernyshov, and now Andriy Yermak, being served notices of suspicion. This is unprecedented. This has never happened in Ukraine before, for the closest people to the president to be actually charged with crimes. It is a good sign. It also means that, in a way, he does not, go out of his way to protect his people, although he does have this tendency to protect his own.
Do you think at this point, we're coming up on the 7th anniversary of him coming into office, does he have a way to turn this around? Like, what are his options from here?
Honestly, I do not know. He does not seem to be a very flexible person mentally in this way. If he really wants to have a chance at being reelected, he definitely needs to change that mentality. But he never struck me as someone being very sensitive to feedback. He always saw criticism as something very personal. But this was always the case with Ukrainian presidents. None of them, none of the six, was ever able to really change by getting feedback from the people. I remember his presidential debate with President Poroshenko at the time in 2019. And Zelensky then said that we have two Poroshenkos, one being patriotic, one defending Ukraine, and another one corrupt. And I think that this really is something we can say about Zelensky right now. We see him, or people of Ukraine often see him, and the sociology, the polls prove that, see him as a rather good defender of Ukraine internationally, but judge him poorly as, Ukrainian president inside of Ukraine.
Having laid out how far he's come, we have to ask the question, does Zelensky still represent the voice of the Ukrainian people who elected him? And before we can address questions of public opinion, we need to straightforwardly address the question of his legitimacy, which I've alluded to several times but will state plainly again. Until democratic elections can be safely held in Ukraine, Zelensky is the legitimate president according to the constitution, and the majority of Ukrainians view him as such. Even his critics, including would-be rival candidates, acknowledge that it's not possible to hold democratic elections in Ukraine while Russia is actively attacking. Too many people are displaced from their homes internally and abroad, and thousands more are serving in the armed forces, making it impossible for a vote to be truly representative, to say nothing of the logistical and ethical issues around campaigning during war. The only group that really benefits from saying Zelensky is illegitimate is Russia. It's a convenient way for Putin to say that he's not obligated to negotiate with Ukraine, which is a talking point that cycles in and out of Kremlin rhetoric when no other excuse is readily available. While there is growing talk within Ukraine about what future elections could look like and when they could take place, it remains a distant hypothetical. Because it's one thing to say, this is how we could stage elections the moment a ceasefire is reached, and another thing to actually get to that ceasefire. Just anecdotally speaking, I don't know anyone who's preparing to vote anytime soon, or sees it as a matter of extreme urgency. It's important for Ukraine to demonstrate willingness to hold elections when conditions permit, But thus far, conditions objectively do not permit. But legitimacy established, what do the Ukrainian people actually think and feel about Zelensky at this point? Does his work on the international stage outweigh his questionable domestic policies? Yes and no. Polls placed Zelensky's approval ratings in the 90% range when Russia fully invaded in 2022, and they've never dipped below 50% since then. There was a peak of around 74% approval this time last year, when Zelensky was standing up to the ham handed negotiations of the second Trump administration. Then that declined last summer after he signed a controversial new law that would strip key anti corruption agencies of their independence, which to many signaled an unprecedented slide towards authoritarianism by the entire presidential office. Now, Zelensky ultimately walked the law back after mass protests erupted, but it was still a huge blow to public trust in him, and his domestic approval ratings reflected that. As of this spring, his ratings have risen back to around 62%, but the controversies are far from over. Like we talked about earlier, there's debate about how much Zelensky could have been truly oblivious to the schemes of his close associates. And there are rumors that he knew about the fraud or even owned one of the properties that had been developed with illegally obtained funds. Zelensky hasn't been named in the probe and won't be charged with anything while he's in office anyway, but you can see why further implication could be destabilizing to his image, and thus destabilizing for the country that still largely rallies behind him as a wartime leader. But rather than just telling you polling numbers, we did some polling of our own on Kyiv streets.
There were many promises, there were many pre-election promises, but they were not fulfilled at all. In fact, I think the voters were misled. Ukrainians were dissatisfied with Petro Poroshenko's tenure, and they voted accordingly for Mr. Zelensky's team. But in addition to Mr. Zelensky, a lot of people came to power who really shouldn't have. And now these people are making decisions, and we live according to those decisions, including decisions made by the Ukrainian parliament.
In any case, Zelensky has to come out and tell people what he thinks about Yermak and the rest. He has to take responsibility. He is the president, the commander-in-chief.
Can he somehow regain trust now? Change your mind?
No, he can't. Not for me. Maybe it's possible for others.
How do you, in general, assess Zelensky's term and his leadership?
It's very hard to say because I voted for him. I voted, like most Ukrainians, against Poroshenko. The majority of us voted that way. There was hope. In the first years, he wasn't off to a bad start, as much as it was possible for someone without political skills and knowledge. It's hard for me to comment on his actions now because in some moments, I would personally behave differently, but this is my personal opinion. But on a scale of 10, I would give his governance a 4.
What do you think about the recent corruption scandal in which Zelensky could be accused of building houses near Kyiv with his friends? Do you think that Zelensky should personally bear responsibility for this?
Yes, of course. Of course. A person who chooses his own team of people must be responsible for them. I don't believe Zelensky didn't know. But now we have a full-scale invasion, and he is the commander-in-chief. Right now, I think, it's not that it isn't important. But this will have consequences later. Now, I think, is not the time. But he must remember this, and he should know that he won't escape punishment in this and other cases that will be opened. I really hope that cases will be opened and closed fairly, and everyone will finally be brought to justice. No, I think he's losing trust. At least he lost my vote.
This is quite interesting and confusing. I also voted for him. I thought this could be the president who could change something, because we were really fed up with the former authorities and their inaction. I thought he was the kind of person who could change something in this country. A young, promising leader. The beginning of his term was indeed such a shift. It seemed that there would really be changes. He is responsible for the people he brings onto his team and into the government. That is, for example, no one elected Yermak. We didn't go to the polls and elect him as some sort of acting president. And he completely took over the governance of the country when Zelensky is not there. Yermak should be in jail for his wrongdoing. As for Zelensky, commenting on the actions of the commander-in-chief now is wrong, because he should keep doing what he is doing.
How do you, in general, assess Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership and tenure?
About 9 out of 10.
Can you explain why?
Well, let's put it this way. When we elected him president, we thought something would be different. And in principle, he copes with his duties, although he could do better.
9 out of 10 is high.
Well, yes.
Do you think he has enough trust now to continue being president during the war?
Well, the confidence level is, I think, 50%.
I'll tell you honestly, he generally is a decent person. He loves decency. The fact that he is now surrounded by, he is simply forced to work with them. I have many friends, retirees. They really, really trust him. They do. It's just that he has this circle. But people trust him. This is not about him. The responsibility lies with his deputies, not him.
How do you assess Volodymyr Zelensky's tenure and leadership?
If we take the period before 2022, there were a lot of good reforms. You could say he was the best president. But now, what is happening in Ukraine, these cases of illegal mobilization, these corruption scandals, honestly, I can't be positive about what is happening now. I can't say if he should bear personal responsibility for this, but it is obvious that he knew everything. When everyone in your circle is involved in corruption, it's impossible not to know. We still have many people who trust him as president. But compared to 2019, trust in him has, of course, dropped.
Zelensky's legacy within Ukraine is still fluid, and in any event, it won't calcify until after the war is over. The broad objectives of his presidency are clear: to get the country to an acceptable peace and to simultaneously set it on a path forwards towards an integrated European future. But at this point, we are forced to ask whether that's what he's really doing, if the future he's leading Ukraine towards is the one that his voters asked for. As my colleague said, Zelensky is not always the most receptive to feedback, but he has listened to the people when it counts, which is why Ukrainians keep speaking up.
Hi, this is Tim Zadorozhny, an international politics reporter with the Kyiv Independent, and today we've got an interesting question from our member saying, I'm a little curious about all the talk of drugs by propagandists. Is there some sort of known basis for this, or is it just a comedian stereotype? So as you could understand, our member is talking about Zelensky's alleged drug addiction. So, do we know if Zelensky does drugs? We don't, because we don't spend our days around the Ukrainian president. But what do we know about this claim? It comes from the 2019 presidential campaign in Ukraine, because Zelensky's opponent back then was indirectly accusing him of doing drugs. So what did Zelensky do? He went to an independent lab, he did a drug test, and the test showed no traces of drugs in Zelensky's blood. After 2022, the Kremlin's bot networks, they picked up this narrative, and even the Russian president accused Zelensky of being a neo-Nazi drug addict. So we know for sure that Zelensky is not a neo-Nazi, and we can assume that he's not a drug addict. So why do they spread this narrative? They spread this narrative to make you associate the Ukrainian president with drugs, with weapons smuggling, with human trafficking, because those are the claims that they spread about Zelensky. We know that almost all of them are not true. They want you to stop believing that Zelensky is a leader of a nation that defends itself against an aggressor. So that is the point why they spread this narrative. At the same time, in Ukraine, the perception of drugs is pretty bad. That's why Zelensky's opponents were using this narrative inside the country. So that's what we know for sure. We know that Zelensky did a drug test. It showed no traces of blood. We know that there is no known basis to support this claim. And we know that the Kremlin that spreads a lot of fake news about Ukraine and the Ukrainian president. They are responsible for spreading this narrative on the international stage. At the same time, it's not the first narrative of this kind that the Kremlin spreads about Zelensky, and that's just their tactics of flooding the zone, of spreading fake claims about the Ukrainian president to undermine the international support for Ukraine. So that is their motive, and we can assume, because there was no fact that would support this argument, that Zelensky is not a drug addict.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.